Shannon. I am still sick, but faking it. So we are going to get through this video together. Today, what I've done, because frankly, I don't think my voice could handle 2 full days of lecture, unfortunately. Sorry about that. But I can get through this with you guys so that I include all the examples that I would have normally gone through. For this video, what I would do, there are 2 sections, 2 portions to it. One, you're going to put any practice questions, you're going to put those directly into the text box. And because of my recent, I didn't close that parenthesis, because of my recent issue with the hub, I would maybe save it in a Word document first and then copy and paste it into the text box. For number 2, there's going to be a little half sheet graph at the end that I'll ask you guys to leave before the end of class, okay? So to start, I wanted to give a little bit of a refresher on the difference between our short run and our long run in terms of theory of the firm. In short run, all that means is that there is at least one resource that is fixed. Now, there's some confusion on that I've talked to students where they say, how can a resource be fixed in the short run but not in the long run? And so we'll take a look at examples here. So we're going to start on the right here. So we have like wait staff, okay? Wait staff is an extremely variable resource because not only can you easily hire or fire someone in a position like a waiter or waitress, if you've ever worked at a restaurant, restaurants constantly have fluid staffing. So you might, for most places, you might say, I work Tuesday at 7, and then whenever the restaurant dies down, they'll do what's called cut you, and they'll tell you to go home. So what a manager does is they sit on, when I used to work in restaurants, the manager would stand there and have 5 or 6 waiters and waitresses there, and then as it dies down, they would start to cut you, and then cut down their wait staff to better match what is happening in the output of the restaurant so that you don't have 10 people standing around watching 3 people eat dinner, right? So it's an extremely variable resource. If you get busy, you can call people in and say, hey, can you come in right now? And if it gets slow, you can cut people, so it's easy. It's related to output. Food as well. If I am increasing my output, then my costs for variable resources rise. If I am not selling a lot, then I don't need to buy a lot. And it's pretty straightforward. Now on the left, you have what's more like a fixed resource, so a building, okay, a location. Something that cannot be adjusted in the short term. If I'm at Tijuana Flats and it gets busy, they don't just go, okay, well, why don't you go next door? We built another Tijuana Flats, right? But in the long run, all resources are variable. So that doesn't mean that buildings are not a fixed resource. It means that in the long run, everything can be adjusted, right? So a good example that I use is if you think about whether, let's say you have a job now or you got a job right now, there is probably a pretty low income cap for most jobs at your age, right? So I might say in the short run, what's the most that you could hope to make? Maybe you're parking cars and you get tipped and you're making tops $20 an hour, most likely far less, right? If you get a job at your age, you're probably sitting at minimum wage, maybe a little bit more, you're making 10, 12 bucks an hour, right? So in the short run, you might say, I have kind of a salary cap. But in 10 years, I would hope that that's not your salary cap, right? In 10 years, you have things like experience, education, training, all that kind of stuff. And so your salary cap is completely variable, right? In the short run, you might have restrictions that in the long run completely disappear because of time and experience. So in the short run, a building would be a fixed input or a fixed resource because you can't just make a new building. But if the owners of Tijuana Flats want to open up a new location, yeah, 3, 5, 7 years, that is plenty of time to get a new location open. So the long run is when all of those fixed resources become variable because we can plan for the future. Now some reminders on how to read cost curves here, just because it's been a couple days. So we've got our marginal cost, so the cost of having one extra output, our average total cost, which is our short run curve, our average variable cost, and our average fixed cost. So why would a firm want a low average total cost is a real straightforward question that we need to be able to answer. What this is measuring is the total cost of a firm, the average total cost, what we're looking at, divided by the number of outputs or the number of products or services that we're providing, okay? So I'll give you an example of why this is important. and why it has nothing to do with price. Okay, so an example here that I'm going to give is like owning a lawn service. So let's say you decide at your age to run a lawn service. So you have to rent out like a nice, expensive industrial mower, right? Now you have a fixed cost, let's say a fixed cost of how much that mower costs you every month. Okay, you are paying that whether you mow one lawn a month or 40 lawns a month. Okay, so in your best case scenario, so in the beginning, let's say here's my average total cost. Let's say it's $400 a month to rent. If you mow one lawn, you have $400 divided by one lawn. So your average total cost is $400 a lawn. Now you are already paying for that mower. So the more, as I'm going to the right here, the more lawns you sign up to mow, the more divided that cost is among your various outputs. Okay. So you mow two lawns, and now each lawn only costs 200 of yours. 3, 4, 5. When you're down here, and as you'll see, your total cost starts dropping because your cost for the mower hasn't changed. And so the more you actually mow lawns, the more money you're able to keep. I'll give you an example here with your fixed cost. Let's say the mower is $400 a month. As you start mowing 40, 50 lawns, the fixed cost is so low, and everything after that is you get to keep that as profit, right? In so many words. So you want a low average total cost because that means that more of what the customer gives you goes straight to you and not to costs, right? In the example from the previous video you guys watched when he was talking about tacos, and a lot of people in class were like, who cares if a taco costs the producer 60 cents to make or 30 cents to make? Well, if you're selling a taco for $1 and it costs you 60 cents to make the taco, that means 60% of what the customer gives you doesn't go to you. It goes to the, tortilla producer and all that kind of stuff. But if your taco only costs you 30 cents to make, you're keeping 70% of that for you, right? So that's why we want our low total costs. Now, this is all the same thing. I don't need to get into these ridiculous clip arts, but you get the idea. What we're looking for here is our average total cost, and we want it to be as low as possible because we want we want a situation where we are able to keep as much of the revenue as possible and not put a bunch of it toward costs, right? Okay, so what I'd like you guys to do right now is in a second, I'm going to ask you to pause the video. I've given you 5 tables here. I want you to do 2 things. First, I want you to refresh yourself on how to fill out average fixed cost, average variable cost, and average total cost based on these figures. So you're going to put that on your excuse me. Still sick. So you're going to put that on your half sheet of paper. So this is going to go on your half sheet. And then second is going to be your first graph. So practice question 2 is going to be a graph based on graphing average fixed cost, average total cost, and average variable cost. So I would pause right now. These 2 are going to go on your half sheet. So nothing is in the text box yet. And so you'll have this table and this graph. Okay. So take a minute to do that and then click play when you're ready to move on. Now, practice question 3 is going to be in the text box. So I want you to look at your diagram from number 2, this diagram that you just did on the sheet of paper, and I want you to think which level of output do you believe would be most beneficial to the chosen firm and why. So you're going to be looking at your average total cost, that column once you figure it out, and your graph, which will show that column as well, but in a diagram. And I want you to, in words in the text box, answer which level of output you think would be most beneficial in terms of revenue and optimization. Okay. Again, pause this and then click on when you're ready to go. Okay. So I want to talk about economies of scale really quickly. Now, when we talk about scale in economics, all we're talking about is size. So when we're talking about economies of scale, we're saying the economies of size of a particular firm. So we have our graph here on the right, and the graph, just like the average total cost curve, is the same thing as the short run curve. This economies of scale diagram is the same thing as our long run. We'll get into that in a bit. Basically, what we're looking at is, you didn't hear that? Okay. Basically, what we're looking at is the curve that demonstrates how increased output increased input can lead to more efficient output. So if we're looking at average total cost here, what this right here would represent would be a firm that is making very little and it is costing a lot of money. And so as you increase output using those resources, the average total cost would decrease. And I'll give you an example. So let's say we're going to use an Italian restaurant with a pizza place this whole time. Let's say you spend, $20,000-$30,000 renovating a building to be, a nice brick oven Italian restaurant. If you spend all of that money and then you sell one pizza a day, your total cost is going to be extremely high and your quantity of output would be extremely low, meaning your average total cost would be extremely high. And all this curve shows is that you've already spent the money to refurbish the building as an Italian restaurant. You've already spent the money on all that. So as you increase the output, what you get to do is your average total cost gets divided among more outputs, more pizzas, more meals, more production, meaning the average total cost would fall. Okay. Now, that's pretty straightforward. Okay. That's the same thing as the mower example earlier. You have $400 and you mow one lawn. That lawn costs you $400, right? So as you increase production, your average total cost falls. Now you do have three sections. You have an increasing, a constant, and a decreasing economy of scale. And really briefly, we're going to look at the differences between these. So what you have for an increasing economy of scale is this first third. That's when, and you can see the numbers up here, when you increase the amount of inputs, you see more than that increase in the amount of your output that you get back. Okay, so this would mean like up here you can see doubling our labor leads to more than double of an output because our economy of scale is increasing, meaning it's extremely effective or extremely efficient. Now, a couple reasons this happens, and I'll give you an example. First, in the entry phases of economies of scale, we see increased specialization of labor. Okay, so that means that people are more able to be put in a position to do the job that they're best at and not doing jobs that they really have no business doing. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a pizza place and you have one employee. Okay, that one employee makes pizzas, cooks the pizza, cuts the pizza, serves the pizza, picks up the check, seats the next set of customers, cleans the tables, takes the orders, makes the next pizza. They might be doing all of this, and although technically all the jobs are getting done, it would be far more efficient if they just stayed in the kitchen and just made pizza all day, right? So let's say you go from this one person right here, this one person making pizza. I think it's the same guy I used from the other video. One person making pizza, and you just hire one more person. And you say, you stay in the kitchen making pizza, you go in the front of the house, you take orders, you clean tables. You make pizza, you take orders. Even though all you're doing is doubling your input, so doubling your labor, this person will be so much more efficient at making pizza that they will make, I would guess, more than twice as many pizzas because you're cutting the amount of time that they're having to worry about tables. You're cutting the amount of time they're having to worry about tickets and all sorts of stuff, cleaning, running back and forth, decreased quality because they're not sitting there watching it cook. And so you would see an increased return of scale. I think I gave the example with an H-E-B as well, or a Kroger, where if you had one person stocking shelves and cashing people out, that would be extremely inefficient. But if you just hired one more person to just cash people out, to just stock shelves, you would help more than twice as many customers, even though all you're doing is doubling your labor because they're more specialized, right? Same thing with management as well. You would have a specialized management. So you could have, instead of just a person in charge of the restaurant, you would have something like an executive chef, a head waiter, a floor manager, things like that, people who are specialized in that field. The other one is, where's the other one? Efficiency of capital equipment. That might be like the pizza oven. So you spend, $4,000 on a pizza oven. If you're making one pizza, okay, that's $4,000 divided by one pizza. As you make more and more and more, you start to use that resource constantly, and it helps decrease your costs. Constant returns of scale is just going to be 1-to-1. So if I double my production, I am going to double my output. That would be like if I'm looking at a piece of factory equipment that makes 1,000 t-shirts a day, and I buy another piece of equipment, it's going to make 2,000 t-shirts a day. I have doubled my input. I will get double the output. but that's what we see there. Now, in the back end, we have what's called diseconomies of scale, or decreasing returns to scale. Up here, you'll see that when I double my input or I double my labor, I see less than double output. So this would be when the returns are less than the actual investment. And this is what I personally call the regional manager problem. Okay, this happens for a couple of reasons. As firms grow and they start investing and growing, and more labor and more capital, you see a couple issues just by the nature of a firm getting bigger that don't necessarily help output. So a couple I put in here in the corner. As firms grow larger, they see difficulty in communication as their operation gets larger, right? So all of a sudden, so let's imagine you have your Italian restaurant and you open 2 branches, right? So it's pretty easy to bounce between 2 restaurants, but then you have 2 restaurants in Georgia and then 2 restaurants in Texas. Well, how do we make sure they're all high quality? Well, they each need a manager. Okay, well, that increases our costs, but the manager doesn't make pizza. It just helps make sure the restaurant continues to work well. So that means your cost, as you'll see on the right end here, your costs are rising, but you're not really making any more pizza. Those are costs just associated with having a bigger operation. Well, how do we make sure those managers are all on the same page? Well, maybe you get a regional manager. Okay, well, the regional manager is in charge of all them. Well, how does that regional manager make sure that they're up to quality? Okay, well, maybe they put a team together, quality control team. Okay, well, who's going to be in charge of that? Well, let's hire a director of quality control. And you can see how it just expands and balloons into this whole thing where you wind up with all these extra people who don't actually make pizza, but they're in charge of making sure the people who make pizza are doing their job, right? And these costs just balloon toward the end, and they're not actually doing anything, right? I think the U.S. military is a great example. If you look at the U.S. military during any like major conflict, World War II is a great example. If you take the amount of people in the active duty military during World War II and then figure out what percentage was actually fighting, it's a very small fraction, because the majority of people are trying to clothe, food, supply lines, gasoline, just logistics, healthcare, communications. The logistics of a large operation are so daunting that for every one person, say, fighting on the front lines, there's 40 people behind them just trying to keep the wheels on the trucks. And that's true with any large organization. You find difficulties in quality monitoring, right? So you might have, I think McDonald's is a great example. McDonald's is so large, and they franchise in so many different places and ways that it's just difficult to monitor quality at a certain point, right? Or really any restaurant that you go to that's a chain, if it's any larger than regional or semi-regional, it's difficult to keep up that quality. Because again, what are you going to do? Hire quality managers? Okay, well, who makes sure they're okay? Director of quality management. Well, who makes sure they're, and then it gets ridiculous. So you wind up with this high cost toward the end, but very little output, because guess what? The quality manager does not help burgers get made any faster at McDonald's. They just don't. And then this last one is poor worker motivation in a larger operation. I've used this example before where if I were to run a tutoring session with 4 of you, and at the end of that tutoring session after school, I said, hey, by the way, before you guys leave, can you do me a favor and pick up like 1 or 2 pieces of trash? I guarantee you, no matter what combination of 4 of you are there, each one of you is going to pick up at least 1 piece of trash, right? If I were to ask you as a class, and be honest about this, if I were to ask you as a class at the end of a class period, hey guys, before you walk out, can you please make sure to find some trash and pick it up? I would guess maybe 15% of every class would actually try to find something to pick up. And that's no knock on you personally, maybe. But the reality is that as organizations get larger, the idea of like, oh, someone else will take care of it kind of steps in, right? Like if there's a huge group of people taking care of something, then it's quite easy to just step back and say, oh, somebody else will take care of it, right? And in a large operation, it is easy to hide. Okay. Comment down here explaining that for lifeguards. And if no one is, if anybody hasn't seen this movie, this is a great example of that. This is the movie Office Space. It's very much worth a watch. Okay, practice problem number 4. This is going to go in the text box. Okay, so number 4 is going to go in the text box. You're going to use an example of a real firm. So I want you to say like Jimmy John's, Kroger, whatever, and explain how a firm like that can have achieved increasing or constant economies of scale. Basically, something that the firm does. So a firm you're familiar with, pick something you're familiar with, Nike or whatever, and explain how that type of firm or that firm would have achieved economies of scale in at least one way. It's pretty general, so just use a firm you're comfortable with. Okay, you can pause that and then play when you're done with that. Okay, so I want to look at the short run average total cost curves. Okay, so I want to emphasize this SRATC is the same thing as this average total cost. It's just that when we look at it on a cost curve like this, it's assumed that we are looking at the short run because all I'm showing you is this average total cost. Okay, so this might be like us with one Italian restaurant, right? So let's imagine this is a cost curve of us with one Italian restaurant. Now, when we look at short run cost curves in this format, what we're really looking at is different possibilities. So each one of these short run cost curves represents a fixed resource. So this is us with one restaurant. This is us with 2, 3, and 4. It doesn't mean that we have all 4. It means that we have done the kind of cost analysis to see what would our business look like if we had 1, 2, 3, and 4 restaurants. And based on our quantity down here, this is what we perceive the market demand to be. So like, let's say there's an increase in demand for Italian food because of tastes and preferences or whatever. If that increases from Q1 to Q3, we can look at this and say, okay, what number of locations would be best for our business model? Okay, so that's the easiest way to look at it. This is kind of like multiple universes where we're looking at our lives if we had 1, 2, 3, or 4 restaurants. Okay, now when we're looking to analyze this, if I were to look at this, and again, let's say we're starting at Q1, this is my average total cost curve, and if my market demand is at Q1, I'm doing pretty good because my costs, if you can see here, my costs are fairly low, whereas it could be higher here. Now, if the market demand were to increase to Q2, we can see that if I follow Q2 up, which is what you need to do, you follow it up, boom, this is 2 locations, and this is 1. So in this market demand, Q2, although my cost wouldn't change all that much between 1 and 2, if I opened up a second location, despite the fact that it would cost more in the short term to build a location, my average total cost per meal, let's say, would actually be significantly lower. And I could show that by going kind of cost 1 right there, excuse me, and cost 2. So here you would say it would be more beneficial, or at least more cost efficient or cost optimal to have 2 locations. Same thing, let's say there was an increase in demand to Q3. Technically, Q3 can be satisfied by 3 locations because that's representing our third, and 4 right here. Now 4 is technically capable of taking care of it, but it's kind of on the low end. So why would I build a 4th location just to be dissatisfied when demand falls in the future? But it's well within the range of 3. So I would say that my most optimal average total cost would be 3. And so in this universe of Q3, I would say that the 3rd location would be most optimal. Now, if we're looking at long run, the long run average total cost is also known as a planning curve. So basically what it does is it takes the lowest point of every short run average total cost, and it just connects those to create what's called a planning curve. So basically, if I'm looking at this and I have, let's say, 1 location, I can say, depending on where the market's at, how many locations would that put us closest to, right? So like if I have, let's say we're at Q2, and this is my market demand for Italian food, and then there was a Q right here, I could figure out how many locations SRATCM is, and then I could plan accordingly on that, okay? really straightforward. There's not much we really do with it, but it connects all of that so that we have an idea of planning for the future of the firm. So if I'm looking at this, SRATC 1 through 4, or my short runs 1 through 4, represent different restaurant locations. If I'm the firm, what what should firms in the long run do with the market information provided? What I was going to ask you to pause, but my throat's killing me, so I'm just going to move on. If I'm looking at the market information provided, I'm seeing that technically I can satisfy this market demand with one location, but it's an extremely high average cost. So it would be more beneficial for this firm in this instance with, ceteris paribus, all things equal. My average total cost would be significantly lower if I had 2 locations. And so that would be what this would be telling me. Okay, so we've got last couple of things. Questions 5 and 6, these are going to go in the text box. So question 5 is asking for what number of inputs a firm could justify purchasing if the demand was increased from Q1 to Q2. So I'm asking for an explanation of how many locations or how many resources or fixed resources the firm would be justified in purchasing and maintaining based on this demand, and why. So please explain why. And then number 6 is asking the same thing for Q3. So that is going in the text box. Pause until you are done with that. And then there's one thing on the next slide. And then before you leave, we have 2 graphs to add. So you have your graph from before. Your graph covers the cost curves and the table. And then I'm adding 2 long run average total cost curves here. One of them is asking for Q1 and Q2. The other one is also asking for Q1 and Q2. And I am using Italian restaurants for these as well. So at the end of the day, you should have a half sheet that you're giving me, or a full sheet if you need, that has the table, cost curves, graph 1, graph 2, both of those here. And everything that is not a graph or a table should be in the text box. I think it might be 3, maybe 4 questions. Okay. Again, guys, I'm sorry about my voice. Hopefully, I didn't even do a sound check. So hopefully you can hear me. If not, then I'm sure this will be fun. As always, I'll be in class during this. The only reason I couldn't lecture is because of my voice and because I'm frankly still sick. But I hope this is a better aid for you than just kind of reading and following on others. And hopefully some of these examples helped clarify. Next class, we're going to go into profits and revenues. Monday and Tuesday, I'm hoping that I'll be good to lecture on those and just move through that way. Okay, thanks guys, good luck.